That's right.
Okay, as you know tonight, it's the impact of the American Revolution on the Irish Revolution. I was going to say the other way around. Actually, that's probably a good segue because the theme of my talk tonight is just how closely related they were and how closely interdependent. And I'll try and develop that idea throughout the night as to just how that worked. Probably the place to start would be to remind you that there was a lot of Irish who came to America long before the famine. Everybody thinks that there was just this outpouring of Irish as long before that. In fact, I would say that from the very beginning, the Irish were probably, if not in a majority, it certainly was a large element of the immigration from the British Isles and Scotland, Ireland and Scotland, for the obvious reason that the English took care of themselves. They didn't really need to immigrate near as much as the provinces, the less advantaged areas did. So Scotland and Ireland certainly provided a great number of what went into the American books as British. So there was a lot of them here already that had come in the 17th century and throughout the entire 1600s and throughout most of the 1700s. So that by the time the American Revolution came around, there was several generations of Irish who had become very much part of the 13 colonies. What had also developed was a trade. This is probably not often thought about, let alone talked about, and that is that the growth of Dublin as a trading centre and Belfast was largely the result of trading with the colonies, particularly America. So actually, because I suppose it was a natural thing that a lot of the Irish that were here, if they had a preference, they would tend to trade with Dublin and Belfast, where they'd be familiar with, maybe even have cousins. For whatever reason, the Irish economy by the 1770s, 1780s was largely a creature of trade with the Americas. And that's kind of where I'm going to start here, because then when the war between America and Britain and England is probably a better description, because really Scotland and Ireland tend to be on the side of the Americas, which caused problems to the English. So, but when that war broke out, one of the first things the English did was to impose an embargo and to stop trade between Ireland and England, Ireland and America, and Scotland and America, unless you were actually supplying British troops. That you could do. Now that, of course, had huge immediate repercussions in the galloping prosperity that had been taking place in particularly in Dublin. Dublin had become second only to London, even in Europe. I mean, it was in those days things weren't anything like as large as they are now. And by the way, the population of the two countries were almost the same. Ireland always tended to have slightly larger population than one would expect for its size, but the population between the two countries was not that different, and which was very, very low compared to what it is right now. Like 3-4 million would be maybe England, and 2.5 to 3 million in Ireland. Anyway, as the American Revolution gained a pace, and the decision was made here, and Washington in particular, and the leaders generally, they, in order to recruit the Irish into the Continental Army, they tended to exaggerate or maybe overpromise the Irish that this was really two revolutions, that this had to do with ending the colonial system that England depended upon. So there was a great identification between the fighting for the United States and fighting for Ireland, because they assumed that what it really was a fight for against the exploitation of the mother country against the colonies. And of course, that just fitted in perfectly with somebody who had something now to defend in the United States, that they had position, they had land, they had trade, whatever they had. So the Irish were great supporters of the American Revolution, and George Washington had credited them and said many, many times that without them it would have been impossible. Because if you think about it, the old, you could almost call them aristocracy. Certainly Washington and Jefferson and so on were a landed gentry, a landed aristocracy, and they tended to be the descendants of the first English settlers who were granted large land grants, very much like what happened in the Spanish, in the Latino world, where the first colonists got large land grants, Spanish land grants. Anyway, and while they were the officers and certainly the leaders and the educated class, they weren't the fighting class. So that you needed both. Now, so you had things happening on both sides of the Atlantic, which were feeding into each other. Now, once the war got going, and America was committed to separation and independence, of course, the English were equally committed and determined not to let it happen, as we all know. And the struggle was on. One of the effects was that the English had to move almost a very large portion of its troops out of Ireland and bring them over to America. And what was also a little scary was a lot of them were Irish. So it was a very difficult situation for England, because they had traditionally relied very heavily on the Irish fighting man. So one of the things they did was they employed mercenaries. And as we know, a lot of the English soldiers were German, Hessians. So the military situation became quite complicated very quickly. And as a result of that, the traditional, what's known as the ascendancy, not so much Protestant, certainly Protestant, but Anglican, Church of Ireland, which is Church of England only in Ireland, landed gentry and the wealthy class, if you like, immediately became, literally terrified, because they were now they saw their defenders, the soldiers, leaving and being withdrawn, and this had an immediate effect. So what happened was they formed a home guard, a militia, and they called them the Irish Volunteers, and they were officered by. They were like a mirror of the traditional English military, officered by the Protestant Anglican aristocracy, and made up of young men who were usually second and third sons, who were glad to get out and get a paycheck from both the Presbyterian, the Dissenters, and the Catholics, whatever. But they tended very much to be very much a product of and to defend the ascendancy, the traditional Protestant upper class. And what happened fairly quickly was they became very sectarian, because while they were allowed to form and thrive as an alternative, a substitute for the traditional English army there, they certainly were willing and able to defend Ireland against the Americans and the French, particularly the forces of republicanism, the revolution that was spreading around them. But primarily they were protecting the traditional privileges of their class, particularly the Anglicans. Don't